Segment 1. This is round 3 of the public meetings for the Ports of Plains Feasibility Study, and apologize for starting a little late. We've been having some technical difficulties, and I know some folks are probably trying to log on into the WebEx meeting, but welcome. Next slide. So again, I want to welcome you to the meeting, and please type your name in the chat box if you're calling and you're just indicating that your caller number. I think we have 3, 5, and 6, and this way we can ensure that everybody is accounted for in terms of your participation at this meeting. Also, please ensure that your phone and your computer microphones are muted. To minimize background noise, please check your devices periodically to ensure they are muted. To share a comment or ask a question, you can add it to the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, or by going down in the bottom and clicking on the chat function on the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, attendees can unmute their devices for a question and answer session, and the study team will also review the chat box to address your comments and questions. Next slide. The purpose of the meeting today is to provide you, the public, an opportunity to learn about the Ports to Plains Corridor Feasibility Study and to provide input on preliminary recommendations provided by the Study Segment 2 Committee. The presentation will include both audio and visual components and will be in English. The meeting will be recorded and available online for public to view through Friday, May 29th, 2020. Project materials are posted on TxDOT website at www.txdot.gov. And also we have a link for public viewing as indicated here on the slide. All comments on the study on the preliminary recommendation on the study must be received on or before Friday, May 29th, 2020. This will provide the segment committee an opportunity to consider public feedback before making its final project recommendations. Next slide. Written comments from the public regarding the study are also requested and may be submitted by mail by email to portstoplains@txdot.gov or by mail to the address indicated here, Texas Department of Transportation, care of Ports to Plains Study Team, 5835 Callaghan Road, Suite 200, San Antonio, Texas, 78228 is the zip code. An online comment form and printable version are also available at the address indicated here. And you may also call 512-486-5106 to ask questions about the project and access project materials at any time during the study process. Next slide. So this is an overview of the discussion today. The first component of the presentation is just a quick overview of the House Bill 1079, and then we will talk a little bit about the feasibility study itself, provided with an overview, and then the last portion of the meeting today, we will be discussing the Segment 1 preliminary recommendations. Next slide. Next slide. So the Ports to Plains Corridor Feasibility Study was established by a bill that was signed by the governor in June of 2019. And the bill requires TxDOT to conduct a comprehensive feasibility study of the Ports to Plains Corridor as defined by the Texas Transportation Code 225.069. And the bill outlines that the study must evaluate the feasibility of and cost and logistical matters associated with improvements to the corridor that create a continuous flow, four-lane divided highway that meets interstate standards to the extent possible. Next slide. The bill has several requirements as relates to engaging the advisory committee and the public. So the bill requires TxDOT to establish Ports to Plains Advisory Committee, and the committee is required to meet at least twice annually on a rotational basis in Lubbock and San Angelo. Membership of this committee is limited to elected officials or their appointees that was specifically named in HB 1079. And the main charge for the committee is to review and compile reports from the segment committees to form a full advisory committee report. TxDOT is also required to incorporate reports submitted by the committee into the feasibility study. To date, the advisory committee has met twice. The first meeting was in October, and their second meeting was held in February, one in Lubbock and the other one in San Angelo. Additionally, under the Bill HB 1079, TxDOT is required to establish segment committees. The segment committees are composed of volunteers who may represent cities, metropolitan planning organizations, ports, chambers of commerce, economic development corporations along the corridor, as well as trucking industry, TxDOT representatives, and other interested parties along the corridor. Next slide. There are several milestones that were identified in the bill, and this slide kind of walk you through it. There's a lot of information here, but the top gray boxes, that's the advisory committee meetings that have been planned for the duration of the study. As you can see, there's about 6 meetings, and so far they have met twice, October and in February. And then the orange kind of gold is the segment committees. And here you see with the segment committees, they have met 4 times so far, November, February, April, and May. And actually segment 1 met earlier this morning. And then their final meeting is planned for June of 2020. And in terms of the schedule or the requirements, the key milestone dates that are outlined in the bill, once the governor signed the bill, TxDOT Commission adopted a minute order that outlined the membership of the advisory committee. And then the segment committee reports are due to the advisory committee by June, no later than June 30th. And then the advisory committee report is due to TxDOT no later than October 31st, 2020. And then TxDOT has to submit the report to the governor and the legislators no later than January 1st, 2021. So that kind of gives you an idea. A lot of those, all of the dates are kind of dictated in the bill. Next slide. So in terms of public meetings, I mentioned that the bill requires, public meetings for TxDOT to hold public meetings and quarterly on a rotational basis. And really the purpose of this public meeting is to gather feedback on potential improvements and expansions to the Ports to Plains. And generally we have, done the meetings in conjunction with the study. And below it shows you how many public meetings we've held and where. We've held public meetings in Del Rio, in Amarillo, in Laredo, San Angelo, and then also, San Angelo on February 19th. And then when you come to May, now we're holding all of these meetings virtually because of the COVID crisis. We're not able to hold the meetings in person. So this kind of gives you the gamut of public meetings that we've held as part of the Ports to Plains feasibility study. Next slide. So you'd ask yourself, why is my participation important? Your participation gives you the opportunity to provide input on segment 1, committee preliminary recommendations. And the recommendations that the committee has put forth is going to be prioritized, in 3 kind of buckets. Short term, that's 0 to 5 years, medium term, 6 to 10 years, and long term, 11 plus years. And I'd like you to keep this in mind when we go to the discussion on the preliminary recommendations. If you have any thoughts on which bucket these recommendations should fall, please, provide that input so that we can document that, and that will go back to the segment committee. Next slide. So the next couple of slides really want to walk through the feasibility study itself, give you an overview of what the study actually entails and what has been done thus far. Next slide. In terms of the corridor study feasibility itself, this slide here shows you the scope and pretty much kind of the process we have followed to get to where we are today. This is traditional planning process. When we do corridor studies, we started from the need, the purpose and needs, and then we went and looked at existing conditions, looking at how does the corridor look today from, the actual roadway itself, but it looks like at things like traffic volumes, look at population, look at employment, safety conditions as they exist today. Then we move into forecasting the conditions, and really the forecasting conditions is we're projecting, for instance, how much traffic will be in this corridor in the next 20, 25 years, okay? What would the population of this corridor be, the counties in this corridor, employment, and all of the other factors within the corridor. And then the next area we looked at was the corridor feasibility. The main purpose of the bill was to study the feasibility of an interstate facility, whether it's feasible or not. So essentially, we looked at that, and the data and the analysis indicated that, yes, an interstate facility is feasible. And then from there, we went to the preliminary recommendations, where the segment committee, once the feasibility study showed that the interstate upgrade was feasible, then they developed their preliminary recommendations to develop a roadmap for upgrading the corridor to an interstate facility. And then the next steps, after we finish the meetings, the public meeting will provide that feedback to the segment committees. They will go back and refine their preliminary recommendations and develop their final recommendation and implementation plan, and eventually the feasibility study report that I mentioned earlier would be due to the advisory committee no later than June 30th of this year. Next slide. So a quick overview of the corridor. As you can see on your left-hand side, the corridor is over 900 miles, and as you can see, it goes from Laredo all the way to Texas-Oklahoma line and Texas-New Mexico line, and it's made up of several different corridors, different highways that make up the Ports of Plains corridor, including the existing I-27 up in the Panhandle, for the purpose of the study, it was broken into 3 segments, and the colors on the map on your right-hand side represents which segment. So today, you're in segment 1, that's the New Mexico and Oklahoma borders to Hale County, Lubbock County line. So that's segment 1, and then segment 2, you can kind of see from Lubbock County line to Certain Edwards County line, and then the segment 3 goes from Certain Edwards County line all the way to Laredo at the Lincoln International Bridge. Next slide. So within segment 1, the corridor is 275 miles. It covers 8 counties, and then 2 TxDOT districts. Lubbock and Amarillo districts are within this corridor. Some of the major cities and towns along this corridor in segment 1 is Amarillo, Dumas, Dalhart, and Stratford. But of course, there are some other smaller cities and towns within the corridor. The corridor highways, I mentioned earlier that the Port-au-Plains corridor is made up of several highways. In segment 1, you have I-27 existing portion, US 87, as well as US 287. So those are some of the corridors that make up segment 1. Next slide. I mentioned earlier that we did the existing conditions and forecasted conditions analysis, and this is some of the key factors we looked at. The first factor we looked at is population, and we looked at existing population 2020 versus population in 2050. And as you can see here, the population in this segment is projected to grow by 21% between 2020 and 2050. And the next factor is income. And we looked at the average household income in segment 1. Again, it's projected to increase by 186%, and that's pretty much income moving from 53,000 to over 150,000 in 2050. And the next factor we looked at is employment, and employment in this segment is projected to increase by 8% between 2020 and 2050. So you're looking at 224,000 jobs to about 241,000 jobs in 2050. Next slide. Another element we looked at in existing and forecasted condition, I mentioned that we do look at traffic volumes, what's moving in the corridor today and what's projected to move in the corridor in 2050. And in this case, we looked at traffic volumes. These are passenger vehicles that are moving on today, about 12,000 moving on in this segment. And then average truck volumes, we'll look at, so about 2,800 trucks moving on the corridor today. What does that picture look like in 2050? What's projected? We're projecting, almost a 48% increase in traffic. So you're going from 12,000 to over 18,000 vehicles per day in the corridor. And then in terms of trucks, we're projecting a 43% increase. So you're going to go from 2,800 to over 4,000 trucks per day in this segment. Biggest growth areas, US 87 near New Mexico, where we're projecting it will grow from 6,500 to over 10,000 vehicles a day, and US 87 north of Amarillo growing from over 11,000 to 14,000 vehicles a day. And then, of course, the current, Interstate I-27 north of Lubbock is going to grow from over 21,000 vehicles a day to over 32,000 vehicles a day. Next slide. And another criteria we looked at is crashes and crash history along the entire corridor, but specifically in segment 1. And this is from 2014 to 2018. The segment had a total of 5,716 total crashes, with 61 of those being fatal crashes, meaning that somebody, was killed in that crash, and the crash rate of 109 crashes per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. And that's how we normally measure, the rate of crashes. That's how we look at it statewide, in terms of how many crashes per, million vehicle miles traveled. And in terms of the baseline safety in 2050, taking into account planned and programmed projects that are anticipated to lower the expected crash rates to 81 crashes per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, and we're looking at a crash reduction of about 26%. So that's if we implemented all the projects we have planned currently. Next slide. And a key component of what moves in this corridor is what we term freight, and that's goods moving through the corridor. So we looked at several areas, you know, as relates to this in both existing and forecasted. Freight, total freight tonnage is, you know, projected to grow by 59% by 2050 in segment 1. And international trade as well is projected to grow by over 3 million tons by 2050. And really, although segment 1 is the northmost component of segment of the corridor, a big component of the agricultural, you know, production is sent to markets, whether it's going to the border crossings to be exported to Mexico, or it's going to, you know, the seaports, Houston and all the other Gulf seaports to be exported. So you see a lot of international trade coming out of this segment. And of course, agriculture freight is, you know, expected to primarily be grain, seeds, and some other farm products, including cotton and livestock. We're talking beef production, milk. All of those are kind of key, you know, components of what is produced in segment 1. And also energy-related freight is certainly, although that is a little bit on, you know, the Midland, Odessa, and but at, you know, segment 1 would still also see some impact coming and growth in that area. Next slide. So one of the charge in the bill was for us to look at the feasibility of this corridor being able to relieve traffic, but also, you know, what if you had the interstate, what benefits would that be? So when we did the interstate analysis, as you can see here from some of the statistics, that the interstate would add 3% new lane miles over what we have today. And then with an interstate traffic in 2050 is expected to grow by 20% over what exists today. And some of the trips that would be attracted to an interstate facility would come from other existing corridors like US 385, FM 1061, SH 354, but as well as US 287 towards Dallas and Fort Worth. Those are some of the corridors that, you know, those traffic would move to the Port-au-Prince corridor or the expanded I-27. And certainly the interstate, the benefits of the interstate is that it will result in higher speeds because now you have a limited access highway. You don't have, you know, a lot of stop and go, traffic signals, et cetera. And then also, as I mentioned, we will divert traffic from other corridors. And while the demand for the interstate will be much higher, but you have more capacity, so the congestion potential that will be created is actually improved on other corridors because now you have a facility that can handle more traffic. Next slide. And in terms of safety and mobility, an interstate is expected to reduce crashes by 4% over what exists today. And then also interstate, it will provide an average travel time savings of 24 minutes in segment 1 over current conditions. And for the entire segment from Laredo all the way to the state line, the travel savings is about an hour and a half that would be saved if interstate facility was built along this corridor. Again, additional capacity and full access control of the interstate will reduce crashes, improve safety, and also improve travel time throughout the corridor because you have less friction, you have less conflicts because you don't have roads coming directly to the interstate. There'll be interchanges, so, you know, much more access control facility facilitate safety. Next slide. I mentioned freight movement before and why it's important in this corridor. With an interstate, we project that it would carry over 4,000, almost 5,000 trucks per day by 2050, an increase of 23% over current conditions, and that's in segment 1. And then the interstate facility would bring new truck demand to areas like Dumas, and would draw, trips to US 287 south of Amarillo. So certainly you see, a higher number of trucks because they would be coming to use the interstate facility instead of using, let's say, just 287. And the interstate, as I mentioned earlier, will provide improved travel times and additional capacity to address times of peak demand and decrease delay to accidents, due to accidents. And for freight, time is money. For a truck, everybody's seeing kind of what has happened with COVID and how grocery stores, empty shelves, etc. That's because if the trucks can bring the stuff quickly to the stores, there's kind of a lag. And, you see the shelves are empty because, time is really important to them. If they're stuck in a congestion or they're stuck somewhere else, then they cannot deliver on time. So interstate in this region will definitely, facilitate efficient and safer freight movement. Next slide. And a key component of what was identified in the build was the ability of the corridor to transport energy products to market. And certainly, the analysis shows that projecting to add 70 million tons of freight, that's 99% above this, and this is mostly energy-related freight. And currently, roughly half of the freight tons along the corridor are energy related, and a significant portion of freight is expected to remain energy related. Yes, right now with the COVID, crisis, you hear a lot in the news about, price of oil has dropped. What does that mean? And certainly at some point it will rebound back, and this is going to continue to be a key component of what moves in the corridor. And the interstate will definitely provide improved travel times, increase market access. So that means, the energy products can be moved quickly to the international borders, to move quickly to refinery in the Gulf Coast areas of Houston and other Gulf Coast region, and also enhance reliability of transportation of energy products. I mentioned time is money, certainly for freight movement. Next slide. So one of the key components of the study was the committees, coming up, developing the cost of improving or upgrading this corridor to interstate standards. So what you see here, the two key columns. One column is just for segment 2, and you see the total cost for segment 2. Segment 1, I think these numbers are not correct, Steve. But so the numbers for this is for a different segment. This is not for segment 1, so apologize for that. But the numbers on your right-hand side, the 23.5 billion, that is the number for the entire corridor to make improvements for the entire corridor. Next slide. And the committee also conducted the economic analysis. One of the charges of the bill was to analyze the economic impact of upgrading this corridor to interstate. So as you can see here, some of the economic benefits for this corridor is the total travel cost saving, and these numbers are for the entire corridor, and it's not just for segment is not for segment 1. It shows that $4.7 billion in annual travel cost savings, and this is about $77 billion discounted savings over 20 years. This is in gains in travel time savings as well as crash reductions in the corridor. And then in terms of total annual GDP, increase in GDP, that is $2.8 billion, and you're looking at $41 billion in new GDP over 20 years after discounting it by upgrading this corridor to interstate. How about in terms of total increase in employment? You're looking at over 22,000 jobs, new jobs that will be created within the corridor. And you're looking at over 80% of new jobs that will be within the corridor, and then 20% new jobs that will be created statewide as a result of investing in this corridor. Then the next one is return on investment. Showed you earlier for the entire corridor, we're looking at $23.5 billion. And then for the segment, the number is $4.8 billion in cost. And when you look at that from a statewide, from a corridor-wide, the $23.5 billion, the net return on investment would be $18 billion, or 76% return on investment on that $23 billion. And then also the other economic indicator is looking at benefit cost ratio. And that's really telling you, would this be beneficial, to upgrade the corridor, the capital cost of $23.5 billion, which, in the current net value would be $49.8 billion. So you're looking at a return, a cost ratio of, a benefit cost ratio of 2.8. Next slide. So the next, set of slides is really this is the preliminary recommendations from the Segment 1 committee. Next slide. So the committee developed the recommendations, the first recommendation, preliminary recommendations, and they discussed it at their April 1st meeting. And the recommendations were grouped into 3 categories. The first one is interstate upgrade projects, so upgrading this corridor where it's already not an interstate. For instance, in Segment 1, you have I-27, but it's not the entire corridor. So those areas where it's not interstate right now would be upgraded to interstate. Then the second category is relief routes. I mentioned there's several towns, cities and towns along the corridor that you have to address, through a relief route. And then the third element of the recommendations is safety and operation of projects to address some of those issues along the corridor as well. So those are kind of the three categories of recommendations that was put forth by the Segment 1 committee. Next slide. So this slide shows you the project recommendations. This is upgrading the existing corridor that's not interstate to interstate standards. So there are several projects that have been identified by the committee, and on the list here, you can see, they're broken the corridor up into kind of logical segments. So you see the first one, US 287 from Carrick to Stratford, and a US 287 from Stratford to Cactus, US 287 from Cactus to Dumas, US 87 from Tex Line to Dalhart, US 87 from Dalhart to Hutley, US 87 from Hutley to Dumas, and then the final segment is US 87 from Dumas to Amarillo. And so this is what the committee recommendations, preliminary recommendations are, to upgrade all of these segments into interstate. Next slide. And then this is I-280, I-27. This is from Amarillo to Canyon. Next slide. This slide shows the relief routes. That's the second element of the segment committee recommendations, and there's several relief route studies that have been recommended by the committee, and I'll go through and kind of outline them. The first one is text line relief route study around the city of text line. The second one is Dalhart relief route study around the city of Dalhart. The third one is Hartley relief route study around the city of Hartley. And then the next one is Stratford relief route study around the city of Stratford. The next one is Cactus relief route study around the city of Cactus. And the next one is Dumas relief route study around the city of Dumas. And then State Loop 335 relief route. This is around, in and around Amarillo. And just, a quick comment here. These are not listed by priority. This is just, a list. We started from north coming south. Next slide. And the committee also made safety and operational project recommendations. And as you can see here, there's several that have been made here, and some of this, the public also provided those input and comments. US 287 at US 54. The improvement there is improved intersections in Stratford, and US 87 at US 54 to improve intersection in Dalhart, and US 287 to improve curbs within Hale County. And then I-27 to improve roadway drainage between Hale, Center, and Abernathy. Next slide. So we are going into the question and answer period. So a little bit of house rule here is, please, you can unmute your line and mute your device, but if you are making comments or asking any questions, please state your name before you begin making those questions. As well, you can write your questions or comments using the chat box to submit, and the chat box is on your right-hand side, and you could enter your comments there. Any comments?
Caroline, this is Steve Linhart. I wanted to let you know that in the chat box that the cost estimate for segment number 1 is 4.769 billion.
Okay.
From the Ports to Plains Alliance provided. So thank you for that input.
Yeah, so I'll just repeat the cost estimate to upgrade a segment 1 portion of the Port to Plains corridor is estimated at $4.8 billion. I'll just round it up. Any questions or comments? I don't see anything in the chat box. Again, you can unmute your line, and then you can provide your comments or questions. Okay, we'll give folks a minute in case you're having challenges unmuting. We'll give people a minute or so before we move on. Okay, hearing no comments or questions, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so your input on the public feedback, again, what are your comments on the segment 1 preliminary recommendations? Again, a reminder that all comments must be received on hold before May 29th, 2020. And there's a link that you can go and access. There's several ways you can access information on the comment card. The first one, you can go to the link provided here. The second one is you can print that the comment card and fill it up and mail it to the PO box indicated here. And the third way is you can go to Ports of Plains at TxDOT.gov and you can access the comment card, but also all the materials related to the Ports of Plains feasibility study. And then finally, you can call the number you see on the screen here, 512-486-5106, to get information about the study. And I see there's a question in the chat box on where you can download the accident information slide that was shown. All the slides that were presented today will be available on the Ports of Plains at TxDOT.gov webpage, so you can be able to access the meeting material and this presentation and all the study-related materials. Okay, next slide. So that concludes the public meeting today, and we appreciate your time and appreciate you participating in the meeting. And certainly we look forward to hearing from you, as stated before, on your comments regarding this feasibility study. Thank you. This concludes the public meeting.